We are now coming to the first chapter in part 6. The chapter is entitled Revolution and National States in the Atlantic World. This chapter focuses on the chain of events that began with the American Revolution and Independence War, 1776 to 1783, and then evolved into the French Revolution and Napoleonic period from 1789 to 1815, and the chain of events that emanated from there, including the Haitian Revolution that finalized in 1804, and the independence of all the American colonies of Spain except for Cuba and Puerto Rico, and finally the unification and independence of the European states of Greece, Italy, and Germany. The chapter also focuses on the cultural transformation movements that inspired these processes of political change. Most important is the Enlightenment. What is the relationship between the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment and revolutionary ideas? The philosophers were often people from the aristocracy who thought a little further than their privileged class members and invited the monarchs of the time, often absolutist monarchs, to consider the possibility of certain reforms that would make their states more equitable. Unfortunately, most of these monarchs didn't listen very well, but the people of these countries did listen to the ideas of the philosophers. And so eventually they rebelled. So what are these ideas? The first is the idea of popular sovereignty. This really comes from the philosophy of the English philosopher John Locke. People are not subjects, according to this philosophy. They are not the property of kings. In fact, sovereignty resides with the people, and those in government are there to serve them. So it's a big reversal from the practice of absolutism that we have observed in the previous century. Another very important idea is the idea of individual freedom. This really comes from the French philosopher Voltaire. Then a third very important idea is the idea of political and legal equality. In fact, this idea is reflected in the famous Enlightenment concept that comes to us from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that the idea of a social contract. The governments and the people should negotiate an agreement on how this process of governing is going to happen. So the Enlightenment definitely was a movement whose ideas powered the revolutions. But it was enlightened up to a certain point. For example, there are entire groups of people that were really not considered deeply enough or attentively enough by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. These include women, children, peasants, laborers, slaves, and indigenous people. The chapter includes 3 major foci. One is popular sovereignty and the political upheavals to obtain it. 2, the influence of the revolutions. 3, the process of consolidation of national states in Europe. So we begin with the American Revolution and Independence War. Here we are going to see map 1 for this chapter. we see the 13 colonies of Britain that lay along the coast of the east coast, the Atlantic coast of what today is the United States. We also see how small the United States were when they became an independent, a colony that earned its independence from England. In many of these colonies, there were growers of agricultural products that were then exported to the mainland, including tea, sugar, cotton. So basically, many of these economies were plantation economies based on slavery. That, as we remember, is a form of labor that is not paid. These were colonies of Great Britain, and they were taxed by the mainland, which was broke because of wars. The kings of England waged too many wars, then they got broke, and then they asked the planters to pay them money in taxation. So that's how the rebellion really started. In fact, it's symbolized by the famous Boston Tea Party, where the owners of these plantations threw the tea in the river to protest against taxation. They said, we would rather throw away our product than pay more taxes for your coffers to finance more of those wars that we want nothing to do with. So then what happened on the 4th of July of the year 1776, this assembly of colonists who were about to rebel wrote the Declaration of Independence, declaring also that all men, and I mean men, not men and women, are equal, that people possess the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember, this was based on Locke's idea that governments serve people and not vice versa. And, of course, the Declaration got a lot of support. Who wasn't going to support these ideas? It got a lot of support in the colonies, not so much from indigenous people or even the slaves who were not consulted at all, but definitely from those colonists who were prospering from the colonial economy. Great Britain had such a huge colonial empire that a lot of European nations would see, in a very favorable light, the fact that Britain was going to lose some colonies, because obviously there was always rivalry for conquering more colonies, or who had the upper hand in the colonial empire system. These European countries included the Netherlands, France, and also Germany, which was not a unified country yet. So eventually in 1780, the British surrendered in Virginia to the army, the first American army, led by George Washington. They were helped by French forces. The French monarchy actually had sent some forces to help the colonists of the 13 colonies that became the United States earn their independence. Then eventually in 1703 is when the Peace of Paris took place. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States was written. And we have to say that, to balance, to get a sense of the balance of this whole revolution and independence war, we have a yes to popular sovereignty, we have a yes to freedom of speech, press, and religion, but we have a no to equal rights for slaves, for women, and for the indigenous population. We continue this first chapter of part 6, which covers the revolutionary period, with the subsequent revolution, which is known as the French Revolution. We have to zero in really at the situation of France. In France, there was what is called as the Ancien Régime, the old order. It was a way to govern from the top. It was the type of the style of government was known as absolutism. So the king held all three powers and really was the one who decided about everything. So there was an arcane parliamentary system, but it was up to the king to activate it if he wanted to, and that rarely happened. So now the king is Louis XVI, right? And he, like many monarchies of Europe, was broke from too many wars, including the war of helping the colonists of the US earn their independence. If you remember, just 2 kings before, Louis XIV, the Roi Soleil, or the king, the Sun King, who had reigned for a very long period and provided stability even with the absolutist system, said, "After me there will be a flood." And when he died in 1715, little did he know that this flood would actually happen by the end of that century. So being so broke, Louis XVI thought of summoning the Estates General. That's how this sort of parliament, optional parliament, was called, the Estates General. The intent was levying new taxes. So how did this assembly operate? It operated by estates or social classes. There were 3 social classes. One was the aristocracy, as we know, this parasitic class that lived at the court of Versailles at the expenses of the king and was really not a productive element of society at all. Then the clergy, and remember that the high clergy were often from the aristocratic families, so in a way these 2 classes were allies. And then there was another class called the third state. The third state. That included all the active population of the French economy. Entrepreneurs, merchants, professionals, industrial workers, and peasants. All the productive people were part of the same class. They were, in a way, the wealth of the nation, as Louis XIV knew very well. So when the Estates General was summoned, the representatives of the third state refused to vote by state. Obviously, if the assembly voted by state, 2 classes would gang up against the other class, and they would say, "Oh yes, let's levy more taxes for the work from the productive people in the country, so the king will be happy." And so the representatives of that segment of the population, which was huge and very diverse, refused to operate by voting by state or by social class. So they seceded. They separated themselves from the Estates General and formed the National Assembly. Remember that all this was happening at Versailles in the court created by Louis XIV. Okay. Then something parallel happened that was really perhaps a manifestation from the universe that this revolution was going to happen. Because on July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris assaulted the Bastille. Okay. What was the Bastille? It was a huge prison where poor people were incarcerated, often for debt. So from there, the rebellion spread to all of France. And this is a very important moment. In fact, in France, still the 14th of July is still celebrated as a national holiday. And if you visit Paris, go to Versailles, but also go to the Place de la Bastille. You will see that in the middle of the old city of Paris, there is this huge square. Why is it so large? Because there was a prison there once upon a time, and the people with no firearms, just by the force of their unitedness and rage, destroyed it to the point that no stone over stone was left. So when people think that we need firearms to defend ourselves from our governments, think again. The people who assaulted the Bastille had no firearms, but they succeeded by the force of their union and by the way they felt united. And in the right, they felt they were correct. The National Assembly felt very empowered by this event and eventually produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Remember that man here means men, because women were not really contemplated in this declaration. But the change was made from subject to citizen. And this idea of a citizen declares the sovereignty of the people. So the revolutionaries in France had three ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. Remember that their ideas came from these two movements that were parallel alongside the 18th century, the Enlightenment and libertinism. So liberty was also meant in a sexual and relational sense. And we see that a lot in the behavior and in the works and poetry of the Romantic poets of this period, both in France and in England, as we will view more carefully in our readings. So eventually, the National Assembly wrote a constitution. In this constitution of France, the monarchy would have stayed, but would have lost its legislative power. But many leaders in the National Assembly were not happy with this compromise. They wanted more radical change. They were also aware of the reaction of all the aristocratic families and monarchies of Europe. These families were very preoccupied with what was happening in France. So the convention is the organ that eventually came into power after the National Assembly. The convention declared war on Austria, Prussia, Spain, Britain, and the Netherlands, all these countries that now were perceived by the revolutionaries as enemies because the families of the European aristocracy were aware of what was happening in France and didn't like it. And in order to wage all these wars on these traditional powers of Europe, they did what they called a levée en masse, which means a mass draft. Everybody had to go into the army. Every young man had to be drafted into the army. What did the king do? He and his family tried to escape, but they were found in the famous night of Varennes, and eventually they were decapitated. At that point, it was clear that the compromise of the constitutional monarchy was not viable. Just to really understand how the king, Louis XVI, and his family were just alienated from their people, where they really didn't know what their people were experiencing. They had not listened to the philosophers of the Enlightenment who were telling them, look, there is injustice in your realm. You have to do something about it. Marie Antoinette, who was the Queen of France, came from one of the most prominent families of Central Europe, the Habsburg, from Austria. Well, once she was looking out at the crowd from one of the windows, and she talked to a minister of the king, and the people were protesting. They were ready to assault anything, they were really up in arms and very upset. And she says, what are they complaining about? And the minister said, well, they have no bread, Queen. And she says, well, couldn't they eat some croissant or brioche? The croissant or brioche, as you may know, is a form of luxury type of bread. Obviously, if the people had no bread, they were not going to be able to buy any of its luxury variations. So that can tell you how, what huge gap existed between the absolutist monarchies and the people that they govern. So eventually, when after the king was beheaded and his family as well, there was a way for the most radical groups in the convention to move forward. These people were collectively called the sans-culottes. Culotte is a French word that indicates the kind of attire that the aristocracy wore. It was a very tight type of, today we would call them leggings, that and very elaborate type of clothing that the aristocrats wore, including their wig, etc. But in particular, the culotte made it very difficult for these people to do anything productive. You couldn't really do any physical or manual labor in that kind of attire, and I think that we have seen a little bit in some of the images. So the groups included the Jacobeans, the Girondins, and the Montagnards. The Jacobeans, the Girondins, and the Montagnards, all of them were part of the convention. But eventually the Jacobeans, who were the most radical, took over. And one of their leaders, Robespierre, helped to install what he called the cult of reason. There was also a committee of public safety or health. And these revolutionaries, who were very radical, they wanted to change everything, including the calendar. So they started to call the months of the year from the phenomena of nature. For example, January, because it is very foggy, they called it brumaire, the month of fogs, or brume in French. They were also very liberal toward women. We must not forget that women participated in all the phases of the French Revolution, including the assault to the Bastille and many of the popular movements of upheaval against the absolutist monarchy. So the Jacobeans wanted women to be entitled to have their own property and to get a divorce, for example. However, what happened was that the gap between the aristocracy and the high clergy and the people and the third state was so huge that this predominance of the Jacobeans resulted in what was called the realm of terror, or terror, the period of terror. It was a climate of suspicion, betrayal, in the sense that everybody suspected everyone else. You would be walking in the streets of Paris and somebody would stop you, and if your hands had no calluses, which proved that you didn't do any manual, productive, physical work, then they would just chop your head off. So in this period, about 40,000 people were executed and about 300,000 were imprisoned. Eventually, in 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested. And at this point, there was a feeling that France needed a little more moderation. So then, at this point, the period of the Directory began. The Directory was a group formed of 5 men of property, and it provided some stability at this period. It also opened the way for Napoleon to eventually take over. In fact, in 1799, Napoleon took over with a coup d'etat. So let's focus a little bit on this very controversial figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born in 1769 and died in 1821. He was a general in the French army at the age of 24, a very young age. How was that possible? Well, as you remember, in an absolutist regime based on sort of medieval mentality, the aristocracy was the class that bore arms. Their job was to defend the people from assaults. Now, obviously, the aristocracy of France at this point had all fled because the king was beheaded, and that was their prayer to stay alive. They had those who could flee, those who managed to flee, fled, and the others were beheaded. So the army had no leaders to speak of. So that's how Napoleon, with his skills, became general at a very young age. So from inside the Directory, it's how he took over, and he supervised the writing of a new constitution. He declared himself first consul and then eventually emperor. So what did Napoleon do? In his civil code, in the civil code that he emanated, there were provisions for legal equality of all adult men. But the patriarchal authority in the family was reestablished. So the father had authority over women and children, and in fact, women did lose many of the advantages that they had gained with the Jacobeans. Now we have to look at map 2 for this chapter to really see what the Napoleonic effect was like. By and large, we can say that Napoleon was preoccupied with European affairs. Again, he inherited a country that had made many enemies because it had wiped out the dominant class of the time, the aristocracy, this parasitic class that still held power in absolutist regimes. So he felt besieged by the supporters of the ancient regime. Okay, so what he did is he conquered Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. Italy was actually the country that was most responsive to revolutionary ideas brought by Napoleon's armies. Spain was responded less, and the Netherlands not too much. Okay, he felt that the revolution, or at least some of the ideas of the revolution in France, could only be saved by dominating Europe. In fact, he was so persuaded of that that at some point he sold the entire North American possessions of the King of France to the US for a very small amount of money. This is known as the Louisiana Purchase. Remember that Louisiana at that time was actually all of the Midwest and a large part of the South of what today is the US. And Napoleon was so preoccupied with European affairs that he didn't mind losing that. In fact, it helped finance some of his wars. And then in 1812, he invaded Russia. And that is often one of the ambitions of leaders who want to, dominate Europe in its entirety. So, but it's also a pitfall because the Russian winter is very cold, and if you are not acclimated to that weather, you really cannot survive it. So what often happens in Russia is that they let you invade it, but then when the winter comes, you cannot get out because most of your soldiers will lose their legs to the frost. In other words, really to have an army that is equipped for the Russian winter is very difficult. The same thing that happened to Napoleon would happen later also to Hitler, who really started to lose when he went to Russia. So eventually, having lost the Russian campaign, Napoleon abdicated in 1814. He was exiled into the island of Elba, which is near Tuscany, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Mediterranean. But at some point he managed to escape from there, and he came back to power for the famous 100 days. But then at that point, the British army, Great Britain, that had been really the arch enemy of Napoleon, defeated him in a city of Belgium in a battle in Belgium called the Battle of Waterloo. And this time he was exiled for good in a very remote island called St. Helena. And eventually he died there of natural death in 1821. So now we are going to look at the influence of this revolution, the complex of both revolutions, but the French Revolution with its magnitude had an enormous influence per se. The first area we're going to look at is Haiti, the island near us. We are in western Puerto Rico, and if we cross the Mona Pass, we arrive at the island of the Caribbean known as Hispaniola and sometimes known as Haiti. So we can look at the Haitian Revolution. In this map 3, we get a sense of the location of this revolution. And we see that the island was divided. The west side of the island was a French colony, and the east side of the island was a Spanish colony. We have to remember that Haiti was a very rich colony that produced a very large part of the sugar, coffee, and cotton that France imported at that time. It was dominated by white settlers, a small number of white settlers. Then there were about 30,000 gens de couleur, people of color. These were free people who often were either had small farms or they were artisans. And the rest of the population, about 500,000 people, were black slaves. Most of them were imported directly from Africa. In other words, they had been born in Africa and had gone through the Middle Passage. There were also a number of Maroons, more difficult to estimate, because those are escaped slaves that eventually hide well enough that they are not found. Okay, so the white settlers saw in a favorable light the desire of the colonists of the 13 colonies that became the United States. Their desire for independence, they saw it in a favorable light. So they did send a contingent of gens de couleur to help the rebels in the American Revolution. When these soldiers returned, the white settlers claimed the right to self-government. They said, well, if the the North American colonies can become independent, why can't we do the same, and be independent from France? However, they were not interested in offering any rights to gens de couleur or slaves. But what happened at this point is that because the slave population was so prevalent in numbers, they got organized under the leadership of a famous revolutionary leader from Haiti, Toussaint L'Ouverture. They really got organized into an efficient army. They wrote a constitution in 1802, and in a battle with Napoleon's army that came to repress them, they won. So the Republic of Haiti was declared. It is unfortunate that this republic, which really was the republic that completed the revolution, because it achieved independence and it also abolished slavery, so it achieved real equality, was not supported by any other nation at that time, and so paid a very heavy price for being so ahead of the times then. So we are now shifting our focus to the wars of independence in Latin America. We need to look at the population first. How were these societies organized, and what kinds of groups of people do we find there? One group was known as the Peninsulares, namely people from the Iberian Peninsula. These were usually direct officers of the monarchical authority that governed the colony. And in all of Latin America, they counted in about 30,000. Then there were those called the criollos, and this was an intermediate class of people who had been in the colonies for a few generations and were obviously a privileged class, even though they were not directly related to the central administrations of the mainland. These counted in about 3.5 million in all of Latin America. Then there was a population of black slaves, indigenous people, then mestizos and mulattoes. These counted in about 10 million people. So we see in numbers a clear prevalence of the most exploited classes that included the slaves who worked in the plantations and all of those that related to them, including those remaining of the indigenous populations. So the Creoles did resent the Spanish domination. And as a sort of effect of the French Revolution and effect also of the American Revolution, between 1810 and 1825, Spain lost all colonies in the New World except for Cuba and Puerto Rico. So what happened in those societies is basically the Creoles displaced the Peninsulares and established Creole-dominated republics. In fact, when Napoleon invades Spain, as we know, Spain is one of the three countries that Napoleon conquered within Europe, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, then Mexico, Argentina, and Venezuela started to rebel against Spain as well, against the Spanish crown. We have to remember in this context an important leader whose ideas were influenced by the Enlightenment. This leader is Simon Bolivar. He was from Caracas in Venezuela. And his idea was to form a federation of states in South America, in Latin America, similar to the Federation of States that formed the United States. In other words, he had a very large, a very wide vision for Latin America, that understanding that the power of these colonies in becoming independent was also in staying united with one another. He did try, there were attempts to form that, but he himself became disappointed and realized that it was not possible, or at least it was not the right moment. How did Brazil earn its independence from Portugal? It's an interesting story, because the crown of Portugal went to Brazil when Napoleon invaded and eventually agreed to the independence of Brazil. What kind of societies resulted from these independence wars? Basically, societies that were often dominated by caudillos, or local chiefs, local leaders or dominators that were allied to the Creole elite. So the Creole became the new elite class. There was a continuation of slavery. The question of slavery was not even on the table. And the process confirmed the authority of the Catholic Church. In other words, nobody said that they wanted to separate from the Vatican or to create a context for more religious freedom or diversity. Next, we are going to look at the different ideologies that evolved during the course of the 19th century and that are still, still with us even today. One is the ideology of conservatism, and the other one is the ideology of liberalism. A representative of the ideology of conservatism at the time of the French Revolution is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was okay with the independence of the 13 colonies from England that formed the initial part of the United States, but he was opposed to the French Revolution. He declared that this was a revolution against God. Okay. In fact, many people like him believed in the ideology according to which the Ancien Regime was an order of God. The sovereign, the king, the absolute monarch, his authority emanated from divine authority. These families that the crowns, the dynasties came from, were believed to have been anointed by divine power to govern the state. So obviously, for a conservatist who believed in this ideology, then the French Revolution would be a revolution against God, because it abolished this sense of divine right for the monarchs. It abolished monarchies altogether, and it often also abolished the idea of a Christian God, of a monotheistic Christian God, to really put reason, natural reason often, especially according to the Jacobeans, in its place. The idea of changing the calendar to describe the weather of that particular month is symbolic of that. Then there was the ideology of liberalism. What is this ideology like? Well, it really is largely oriented around the idea of progress. We have seen that by and large, industrial societies become more stable once the industrialization process is underway. Okay, so the idea was that the new era, the era of industrialization, was going to be better. And naturally, this new economic system required a republican government, because absolutist governments were allied with the previous class, the aristocracy, which was a parasitic class and not an entrepreneurial class. However, liberals also believed that it was important for these republican governments to really not simply represent the class of the entrepreneurial middle class or bourgeoisie, but rather to extend more widely the participation in government to more layers of the population of what in the French Revolution had been called the Third Estate. So not only entrepreneurs, businessmen, professionals, but also the workers and the peasants should be gradually included more widely in the process of republican or democratic government. And this was the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and other liberals of his time. Next, we are going to look at the limits of revolutionary ideals. In fact, we're going to look in particular at the situation of women and slaves. What about their rights in this process? In a nutshell, we could say that the American Independence War was an unfinished revolution that led into the Civil War about almost 1 century later. In other words, the fact that the question of slavery had not been brought up during the independence process, that the economy of the independent United States had continued to be an economy based on plantation production that required slavery, was the unfinished part of the revolution that then exploded in the Civil War toward the end of the 19th century. As to the French Revolution, we could say that it also in some ways was an unfinished revolution that eventually established a new dominant class. And this new dominant class was the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, namely those families, those entrepreneurs with capital that were able, based to their capital and their ownership of the means of production, to exploit workers and also to feed on the plantation economy and the products that came from the colonies. Of course, this revolution got finished eventually in the midst of the First World War in the 20th century, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, which was based on socialist principles. But we will see that more in detail later. So in relation to the questions that were on the table, we can look at slavery. And we know that basically the movement of abolitionism managed to obtain the abolition of slavery, which in the United States, for example, happened in 1865. However, even after the abolition, people who had been enslaved and their descendants had freedom without equality. And in fact, this equality, including, for example, the right to vote or the right to compete fairly in a society for different positions in the society, was not obtained until the 1960s with the civil rights movement. So if we look at the group at women at this time, so in a way the concept of the citizen who was not a subject but rather part of a sovereign body of the people was really based on the concept of a male citizen, of a male individual. So the citizenship of women was really not under consideration, even though many women did not agree with that. In fact, one of the texts we will read is by a woman from England named Mary Wollstonecraft, who moved to France to participate in the revolution because she was so excited about it. And in 1792, in the height of this big revolt, wrote a pamphlet called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. In other words, she perceived very clearly even then that in some ways the revolutionaries were a little blind and that they collapsed all forms in which humanity manifests under this male European, this citizen who was actually a European male. And it is important to remember that women participated in the revolution, that they were there assaulting the Bastille. and that therefore their right to reclaim certain effects that would benefit them was a very legitimate. Even if they didn't directly participate, they definitely supported the men who did. And often, for example, even the Enlightenment movement was supported by women of means, who would host these big meetings of the philosophers in their salons. So women were always there in supporting change and in action about change. So a whole movement evolved eventually that reclaimed these rights of women that had not been granted in the revolutionary moments, including the right to education, the right to access to the professions, the right to the status of citizen, and the right to vote, often known as suffrage. Other women, besides Mary Wollstonecraft, that we remember at this time, is Mary Astell and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So we finish this first chapter of part 6 with another area. And this is the consolidation of national states in Europe. We need to focus on the ideology of nationalism. In the 19th century, we see an expansion of the identity that comes from people, from a national community. People aggregate around different forms of identity. For example, families, clans, tribes, cities, regions, faiths. Okay? So through time, we see that any of these and more can be something that organizes people's identity in a significant way. In the 19th century, the communities called nations became a strong element to form identities. And how was a nation defined? What is a nation, one might ask? So the people who are part of a nation, according to this ideology of nationalism, have a common language, they have common customs, common cultural traditions, values, a common history, and often this history is really located in a particular geographical arena. So they also have a territory or a land that they reclaim as their homeland. So we have several manifestations of nationalism, including cultural nationalism. For example, in Germany, the movement, the intellectual and artistic literary movement of Romanticism celebrated the Volks, the common people of Germany, their ways of being, their traditions, their mythologies. Then we have more political forms of nationalism. For example, we have the Italian patriot Giuseppe Mazzini, who founded a movement, sort of an association called Young Italy. And his form of political nationalism was really focused on reclaiming independence of certain areas of Italy from Austria and Spain, from being dominated by the Austrian Habsburg Empire and its alliance with the Crown of Spain. So that also there was a reclamation of a national territory. This is Italy and it belongs to the Italian people. Then there's another form of nationalism is Zionism, which was really a response to the anti-Semitism that grew, that became more acute in Europe with the rise of national ideologies. If having a common faith is what makes one belong to a nation, then obviously Jews didn't belong to that nation because they had a different faith from, say, Christianity, either of the Protestant or of the Catholic type. So in a way, national ideologies promoted national identities, but they also excluded people. And one of the groups within Europe that was most prominently excluded was Jews. Jews had always been ghettoized and marginalized. For example, one of the reasons why Jews often practiced commerce and money lending is not because they were not able to be professionals. They often were very knowledgeable and educated, but they were not allowed, okay, to enter the professions of Europe. So they did what was allowed, what they were allowed to do under the circumstances. In fact, even the word ghetto that we often use to describe any areas of a city or a territory that is marginalized and that is degraded, comes from the Italian word for the area where the Jews lived in Rome, there in a synagogue, which is called ghetto. So the movement of Zionism starts in the 19th century as a search for lost national territory. Jews had been victims of had been exiled, had been forced to move from country to country on various occasions during the centuries since the Christian era, and so now their form of nationalism is to really search for a lost national territory, exactly in the area of Palestine. So the first migrations to that area happened at this time. It was very small at this time, of course. So next, we are looking at the emergence of national communities. Okay. So with the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the powers of pre-revolutionary Europe live under this illusion that the revolution can be forgotten or erased from history. It is, of course, a big illusion, but they believe in it, and so they congregate in the famous Congress of Vienna. Remember that Austria and its empire, the Central Empire of Europe, was really the seat at this point of the ancien regime, of absolutism, of the old way of being organized as a society. So this period is known as the Restoration because their desire is really to reset, to reset time to pre-French Revolution time. And the Prime Minister of Austria, Metternich, a very important name, Metternich, he wore a culotte, very elegant culotte. He didn't wear pants because he didn't work. Said something like this: "What is Italy? Oh, it's a geographic expression. Italy is not a political entity." In other words, his idea was really to deny these national identities that were forming in Europe, and that applied to Greece, to Italy, and to Germany. This sentence of Metternich is something I often quote when I talk about the Caribbean, because I think that today Metternich would say, the Caribbean, what is it? It's a geographic expression. And interestingly enough, when Metternich said that, the patriots that had aggregated under Mazzini in the Young Italy listened, and they said, a geographic expression? We'll let you know that we are not just a geographic expression. And that's how eventually Italy became unified. Anecdotes aside, we want to look at what happens in Europe in this period known as the Restoration. The Restoration proper is very brief because already in 1821, only 6 years after the Congress of Vienna, the people of Greece fight for their independence from Turkey. Greece was dominated by the Ottoman Empire at that time, and they win. And many people, many idealists from many countries of Europe go to Greece to really help the Greek people fight for their independence. This includes one of our poets, one of the Romantic poets that we study, Lord Byron, who is actually a scion of the British aristocracy, but decided to really devote his life to the ideals of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and so actually died in one of the battles for the independence of Greece. Then, in 1848, we observe a series of rebellions that start in France and expand like wildfire throughout Europe. So much so that they caused the collapse of the French monarchy that had been restored by the Congress of Vienna, and they even threatened the Austrian Empire. Eventually, we observed the unification of Italy and Germany. It's very important when you think about Europe to remember that these are very young countries. Okay? When France and England and Spain were already very well consolidated as countries administered by a central monarchy, Italy and Germany were still like an assemblage of princedoms and states that were not organized as a country. So other nations that really looked onto a future dominated by the entrepreneurial class saw the unification of Italy and Germany in a favorable light. Why? Because they would have partners in commerce. To go, say, from South Germany to North Germany, a merchandise wouldn't have to pay tolls, every 100 kilometers. To commerce between, say, Milan and Sicily, one wouldn't have to cross 3 or 4 borders. So the other nations favored these unifications for commercial purposes. And here we go to the map 4A of this chapter, and we see Italy. Okay, we need to remember 2 main figures that were important. There were major agents in this process of unification, which was completed first in 1860 and then in 1870, when the area of the Vatican and Rome were annexed as well. So in the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, at one point the king had a very smart minister called Camillo Cavour. Okay, and this minister really organized a series of alliances in Europe with governments that would see in a favorable light the process that he wanted to put underway, namely to unify the country under the Kingdom of Piedmont. So his diplomacy was really essential in preparing the terrain for what was to follow. Even though many patriots, including those who were followers of Mazzini, didn't want a unification under a monarchy. They wanted a republic, which was more consonant with the ideals of the Enlightenment. The other figure, very important figure, is the figure of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi was a soldier of fortune. He had fought also in Argentina for the independence of Argentina from Spain. And he had this charismatic way of being so that he could assemble armies of volunteers. So eventually he assembled, around the year 1860, he assembled an army of about 1,000 volunteers who were famous for wearing these red shirts. And so they sailed from Genova, the city where Columbus was born, all the way to Sicily. And as they landed, they started to really conquer all the southern part of Italy, all the peninsula. What happened was that the volunteers immediately realized that the people wanted a change. And so many of the young men of the time in all these regions, attached themselves. They aggregated themselves to this army of volunteers that became more numerous. And so the domination of the realm of the 2 Sicilies, of the Bourbon kings of all of southern Italy, collapsed. At that point, Cavour said, "Oh, King Vittorio Emanuele, this is the time for you to act, because if you don't do anything, these people will go Republican, and then there won't be a kingdom anymore." So the king was sent on this expedition to meet Garibaldi near Naples. The city is known as Teano. And that's where Garibaldi arrived. Garibaldi was a Republican. He didn't want to give his conquest to a king. But he realized that this was a compromise. And he was not a politician, he was a warrior. He was a soldier, and so he just gifted the king of Piedmont and Sardinia with his conquest. And that's how the bulk of Italy became unified. Eventually, the papal states around Rome were aggregated in 1870. Then we go to map B, where we observe Germany. So from the Congress of Vienna, this whole area known as Germany emerged as a confederation of 39 states. The largest and most powerful of these states was the state of Prussia. The king of Prussia considered himself the emperor of the Second Reich. The First Reich would have been the Holy Roman Empire, whose emperor was often from Germany. He had a very capable prime minister called Otto Bismarck. Bismarck mentioned at one point that the unification of Germany would be made by blood and iron. So he did enhance the army, and eventually he started to wage war against Denmark, Austria, and France. And eventually that's how Germany became unified under Prussia by the doings of the Prime Minister Otto Bismarck. So how is this sense of kinship, of a national community, of kinship among the people of a nation, how is it symbolized? What are the symbols of these emerging national identities? We can mention flags, national anthems, a sense of patriotism, and from the administrative viewpoint, we have bureaucracies. From the viewpoint of expanding participation, we have public schools, systems of public education that can, to a certain extent, reinforce the ideologies of nationalism. And then we have armies, usually defensive armies. The idea is that, the army is going to defend the national territory from attacks or invasions. The national state becomes a model of political organization in Europe by the end of the 19th century.